Good morning, and thanks for having me. I always try to rethink how I present an economic presentation when it's early in the morning. I prefer to avoid economists whenever possible, and I'm an economist. I also like to avoid policymakers when I can. However, I do a lot of public policy work. So I guess I should have sought more counsel in college. But when you've gone around the block, you've been to enough rodeos, you start to understand the complexities in economics and public policy. And I want to talk about not just the typical economic presentation on where things stand. Data is readily available more now than ever. It's easy to get as much information as you could 10 years ago right on your phone. But the key is to understand what the story is behind it. What is the data telling us now about where we've been, where we are, and then where are we going, and how uncertain is that future? And the very last slide that I have, you'll appreciate, because whenever I talk to a particular community, large, small, it doesn't matter, I like to say, here's how I interpret what I've been seeing. And when it's something where I'm concerned about, I'm always a little bit more cautious and I use more politically correct words. And on this one, I typed bullish. My word correct had a different word, so I'm glad that that happened. But what makes me worry is that why did it assume that I meant that? It must have been from emails. So let's get into the data. I'm going to go through some of the slides quickly. You all can have access to the presentation, but I left some time so we can do some Q&A and brainstorm a little bit and see if there's anything else that maybe we can send in terms of enhanced slides that might answer some additional questions. So current conditions, let's start in Arizona and the US, because how the US goes, so goes Arizona, just to different degrees, and then also the communities within Arizona. When I take a look at the broader US data, there's a lot of different things that you can look at, but the key ones for me are GDP growth and employment growth. And you have to whenever you see a GDP release, they'll say something like 2.4%. What does that mean? Sometimes you got to read the next couple of paragraphs because it'll say there was an inventory correction, we made extra stuff, that counts now, but it's not going to count later when there's a sale. So you normalize it a little bit, but for the most part, it's a good indicator. At this point in the expansion, you're looking for GDP growth of between 1.5% and 2.5%. When we were at the peak, you want to look above 2.5%. When things start to slow and when the story becomes inconsistent, it'll go below that. And this inconsistency is the most important part of what we're covering, except for a couple of policy slides later. Whenever you have a strong expansion, all the economic data is telling you the same thing. It's saying things are going to continue for a while. When things start to slow, the data gets inconsistent. You see some good data points and some weaker ones. You start to question whether or not there's going to be as much housing demand, our population flow is going to continue. And then we have consistent data, but it's consistently bad. I think in this case, though, what's in front of us is going to be a very mild downturn. And for some with history, it'll look a little bit more like 2001 for Arizona, nothing like 2008. So the GDP numbers are still in the range where I feel like we still have a little bit more traction left in the economy. And again, on the employment numbers, you want to look almost at the same thing, roughly between 150,000 and 250,000. So think 1.5, those lines are a little off, but think 1.5% to 2.5% for GDP, 150,000 to 250,000 for employment. But we're probably not going to see many more quarters or months where employment's above the 250. Start to look for a trend where it drops below the 150. And if we consistently see numbers around 100 and then below, that is a signal that maybe the story is becoming inconsistent. And the forecast among most economists is that we'll have a downturn within the next couple of years. Most economists, when they do presentations, though, they always hedge their bets and they say, well, we're not going to have a recession this year. Well, it's October, so they really went out on a limb. I'm here to tell you that I'm not afraid, and our recession is going to begin in November 22nd, 2021. Obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty, but you can still do planning when you see directions. And so, let's say you are heading west to California for some business trip or taking the family to the beach or something like that. The economic data basically says head west. You have to really dig deeper, though, and figure out what's the best road. So the economic numbers are a little bit more like a map. They'll tell you what direction. As you get closer to the downturn, the story becomes more clear as you get closer to the destination. But right now, we're looking at a couple of years on solid footing, I believe. There's been a lot of discussion in Arizona about that we're more volatile than the US as a whole, and that this is an economic problem. However, if we swing a little bit more than the US, but we do much better than the US in almost every expansion, and we do better than the US in almost every downturn, is that a bad thing? No. And so we had the one downturn, again, 2008, where we did perform more poorly, and we were number 49 out of 50 states, and we were 50th for the incremental numbers. Even Michigan and the problems in Detroit, they did slightly better than us over a couple of months in terms of job growth. But now we're doing better, and I think that this gap is going to widen. I've been critical of public policy and optimistic in the past, critical of policymakers, how different organizations interact, and I'm more excited now and more enthused about our long-term prospects statewide than I've ever been, because we've set a good economic foundation statewide. Economists also drink a lot of coffee because numbers are boring usually, unless there's a very dynamic speaker that makes it interesting, which is very rare. We've been dealing with competitive tax rates. We have responsible economic development programs. We're starting to address infrastructure issues, transportation. There's still a long way to go. We're never done fully, but we've set up a solid foundation. And if we keep moving, I think the 2020s are going to be our strongest expansion that we've ever had. And we will continue to be in the top 5 states in the country in almost every economic category. It's difficult to become number 1. Now, we had, sometimes we'll become number 1 for a short period, but you have states like in Idaho where if you add, a Dunkin' Donuts and a Circle K, you double your employment base. So they're number 1 in terms of percentage. But then again, you see some states that jump up there like Texas, and they're huge. And the bigger the state is, the more difficult it is to post strong rates of growth. Arizona, much more robust and diverse than it was before, but definitely a top 5 state going forward. And these aren't in just job growth categories, they're in job quality categories. So we've been growing in terms of volume. Now it's time to shift to grow in terms of volume and have people move up that career ladder and try to figure out how we can increase incomes, which then benefits everybody. I'm sorry, this looks a little blurry on the screen. So this is just our ranking from last year. In terms of GDP, number 4 in the country, personal income growth, number 5, and then employment growth 4, population growth 4. Not a bad year. And it looks like we're continuing to accelerate some. So overall, just the summary, and again, this was a very quick economic overview. And if anybody wants a little bit of a longer version, I keep a kind of a generic slide deck that I keep my colleagues update for me, because one of the best ways of getting up to speed on what's happening in the economy is to just read through your own slides. And it's a little monotonous, but if anybody wants a copy, you can email me and I'll send you a PDF version. Otherwise, it'll get jammed up in your email. But you might enjoy seeing the additional statistics. I think we can be a national leader in growth again, in quantity and quality, and that's really the focus. Can we have the right policies going forward that builds on our responsible budget development in the past and a lot of these fundamentals? Here's where I feel like we need to start messaging this, though. And I've received mixed results when I show some of this data because I see this as positive. Just, you have to look at individual communities when you look at per capita personal income as a percentage of the US, which is one of my favorite indicators because you can make adjustments to it. You have to make adjustments to it based on working age population, cost of living, if you're comparing metros from different states. There's about 7 or 8 factors that we have to adjust for when we look at our competitors and how we're doing. And the Greater Phoenix area, even though it's been very strong, isn't at the top of the list in some of these higher quality categories. But think about it. We're still at this point where we're starting to see that line turn back up. The reason I put a golfer on there is that the best sport to compare it to is golf. And I have a couple of friends that are way better than I am. And we really don't compete. Well, we compete and they always want to bet like $1 a hole and I end up losing $1 a hole, but you got to do that with friends. But I'm really playing against myself. When you look at this kind of data, you're looking at how you're performing on a proper benchmark over time. And so even our strongest performing metro still saw a longer term dip, and we really need to get back up to 100% of the US average. That thing on the on your far right is the fork in the road. I always hate when people say this is a critical time, this is the turning point in the economy, because so many things make the economy tick. But what we do the next 2 years during the remainder of the expansion and how we manage the downturn is going to dictate the quality that we see for the 2020s. And again, I still think we're going to make the right decisions, and I'm optimistic, but that's going to have a bigger impact than what we've seen in the past on any single public policy item. Regional and local. Just wanted to look at a few of the NACOG statistics. It's easy to move the podium when it's flat. I tried to move one on the end of a stage once and it started to fall and I caught it and it was so embarrassing. I didn't recover from that one. But I got to tell the story a few times, so I got some benefit from it. We're doing a little bit of work for the NACOG folks, and of course we had to look at Yavapai in some detail, but what really stood out to me was the strength on almost all the numbers that we looked at. And I've been bullish about this area since way earlier in my career. Maybe about 20 years ago, we did some work for the Arizona Department of Commerce, and it was a county by county analysis, and we had to identify certain regions that were considered tier 2, that were going to be strong tier 1s down the road. And this was the area that really stuck out the most because it matched with the economic story so well. But looking at Yavapai, population estimates still expected strong growth. And you can see Yavapai is the gray one on the top. Here's the numbers that I talked about for Phoenix, but for the 4 counties here. And we're improving, but we need to make that last leap. Now, you don't necessarily, again, I don't determine if I had a good golf outing if I lost to a buddy that's much better. I say this was the best round I've had in the last couple of years and I would feel good about it. In this case, we see some steady improvement in the Yavapai numbers, but I think that Yavapai is in a very similar situation as the state of Arizona because of the growth, the new business opportunities that are going to be coming here, building off the good, strong economic foundations, very high quality workforce. It's at a turning point as well. A lot of other communities throughout the state, their turning point is how do we stop the bleeding? Because it's been very difficult for a lot of communities outside the main metro areas, and this is across the country. It was very difficult expansion, but I feel like there's something different here. Regional building permit comparisons. It's difficult to compare this particular region. Yavapai exceeds in most categories. Top employment sectors. what I found interesting is that there are some, so you're going to have tourism, of course, but healthcare and social assistance. One of the things that we need to work on as a state, and this is something where an effort will be happening, is making healthcare more prominently discussed as an economic development tool and one of our prime industries. And so, for example, when I spent the last couple of years driving around with some friends from AAED and giving a lot of rural presentations, I found that regardless of size of community, it was always a similar issue. But one that consistently came up was we lose our best and brightest, and we have a hard time maintaining doctors and nurses, and that's disrupting our ability to bring in retirees that bring a lot of wealth but lower current personal income, but it's still a net gain to the community because of lack of health care. This last year, there was an effort to create some programs to address that some, and we helped with that, and some funding was provided, but we need to keep pushing for that. And what I would like to see is, I don't think people are going to continue to retire like they used to. So I remember when my grandfather retired, when he worked at Motorola, he was done. And that's when my grandmother started to go more and more insane because he was home every day using her spoons to stir tar, leaving duct tape all over the house. So, engineer. I'm a duct tape fan, so I feel like I can make fun of that. So what I'm hoping to see is that if we have the right programs at the local level, but we need to have the state supported as well. I would like to see that physician that wants to retire and come to this region or go to a smaller community like Payson or wherever it may be, but then only partially retire and work a couple of days at the clinic. And nurses, and increasing those connections between the communities and the community colleges. Education's another thing that we've been working on. I'll cover that a little bit. But I feel like these are tasks that can be accomplished. Whenever you hear recommendations, and a lot of economic development studies end up saying the same thing, it's try to get higher wage industries, get your roads built. Well, it's like, wake up in the morning and, get dressed. It doesn't really help you. It's part of what you're already working on in general. But something like the shortage for doctors and nurses. And Arizona, I believe, is lagging behind many other states that are competing for retirees and second homeowners in terms of its tourism promotion. Well, if that can be modified and blended with local communities, that's a task where you can say this person's going to be coordinating with the state. Bill's going to take over for Janice in 3 months and go do this thing. We're going to be helping down at the Capitol on some of the healthcare stuff that'll be discussed. When you can tell people, when you can say this person in this cubicle is going to be helping this person in this office on this calendar, that's how we all have to do business planning, right? We don't just wake up and say, I wonder what I'm going to do today. Well, we need to run our communities much like we run our lives. And I feel like this is going to be a solid opportunity here just because of the diversity in the workforce. Housing permits for the county as a whole, still looking very much like the state growth, getting stronger. Home sales up. Sales prices still strong. People have asked if we felt that since home prices have gone up so much, if there's a bubble forming like before. I don't think so. It's a different situation right now. You can go through and list just the differences between when people were camping in front of Toll Brothers. I remember that because my wife worked there at one time. She was also the recipient of a layoff because things fell through the floor. But you don't see that in normal economic conditions. You see prices escalate when you have additional demand, there's something that's restricting supply, or you see labor costs very high, materials costs are high, all that kind of stuff adds up. So it's a little bit different. I'm not worried about this as a collapse. And how I like to simplify my discussion of a recession is I like to picture carrying a bucket. I should start bringing props. I know that people like props. That's when Ken Bennett used those damn Kleenexes for the longest time in his presentations, talking about the budget. But I like to picture a bucket, and how much can you hold in that bucket? And back in 2008, that bucket was very light until somebody dumped a bunch of bricks in it and it fell to the ground. Going into this downturn, it's going to be more small pebbles being thrown in. Housing will weigh things down a little bit. Consumer spending being cut back will weigh it down. It's already gotten a little heavier because of the trade issues that we've had. We really need to resolve those. There's massive economic impacts related to the trade war. We've done some of the math with the Arizona Chamber, and it could be devastating if it's not resolved. It will get resolved eventually, but it's difficult to resolve things like that when it's also political and you have an election coming up the next year. But that doesn't change my opinion about being bullish longer term. Employment projections, very strong. This is what I want to get into with where are we going to go. Employment projections, and we've assisted in the past with some of them and reviewed them for different folks. They're based on some recent trends. It doesn't really factor in changes in public policy. It doesn't factor in just the changing nature of each of our communities to the extent that you think it would. Longer term, it usually doesn't matter. But it does matter greatly when you're trying to tell a story. So this is how I like to get through to some policymakers, and I found that this is a popular approach. So let's do a what-if scenario. This is what employment would look like in the county if we added, well, let me get the numbers in a second. So let's assume that all this economic foundation stuff that we set up can be tied to responsible public policy that yields a return on investment to taxpayers. Not just throwing money at things, but saying, we're working on this project, it's going to take this long, here's the return on investment. You're getting more than $1 than the dollar that you're spending back on tax collections, not the economic impact numbers that are often meaningless. That's where we need to go with the public policy stuff, especially in education. But if we can have the right policies and we have some career enhancement, then that means that people will be making a little bit more money. But we also want to see industry enhancement where people can jump from a lower ladder in terms of opportunity to a higher one and then continue to advance. So our goal isn't necessarily to say, let's keep creating a new wage floor in terms of minimum wage. It should be, if there's somebody that's stuck at minimum wage that's too low trying to raise a family, what workforce program isn't working and how can we modify it? The key is to spend those resources and help them move up the ladder, I believe. So I had my colleagues run two scenarios. We do a lot of economic impact modeling. And in this case, I said I would like to see what would happen if over the next 10 years, things went really well. We had great economic development, public policy, sound budgeting, all the different groups coordinating in the county. And we increased the rate of growth by 0.3 of a percentage point. So that would be going from like 2.7% growth to 3%. We're not talking about a lot. I usually like to use tenths in terms of increments, but I think the opportunities with good policy will yield stronger results in percent terms in the medium-sized communities like this one. And what happens if we also, as people are moving up the ladder and jumping to that higher ladder, the wages of new jobs went up by as little as $1,000 a year. So are these lofty? Maybe, but it doesn't seem like a lot. Look at that chart. It's not a major change. Here's what it means though. So that's what the numbers look like. That's what the wedge looks like up close, but what's the value in between those lines? Well, we'd have almost 2,900 additional jobs by 2028. And we'd have 147 million in wages, and the economic output is 374 million. So we're talking about a half a Super Bowl or spring training or a major event. We're talking about big numbers. These, again, aren't my favorite numbers. I like jobs and tax revenue because you have to look at return on investment. We still can be aggressive with our policies, but responsible to taxpayers. Additional tax revenue for the state, county, and the cities, 117.4 million. Okay, well, let's say, how do you use this information? very minor changes in the economy can have dramatic impacts in terms of tax collections. Let's say some public policy was being considered that was really going to help the state economy, Yavapai, other parts of the state. There could be some new national programs, whatever it might be. To me, that indicates that our break-even point is $117.4 million in spending on the responsible items that yield a good return on investment. The reason I like to do these simple calculations, and then on specific projects, we actually have to make them real, not just general examples. We have to get as close as we can to reality, which is difficult. But this shows that we can still make investment in a lot of the things that matter, economic development programs, but the responsible ones, tax policy, everything else. And there can be money for it. This gets back to that question of, how much do you spend maybe on your business? You have to spend money to make money. I like to keep our computers very much up to date, our internet fast, all the basics as set up as possible because my colleagues can be more efficient. It's kind of the same thing. We're bringing in how we run our personal lives and our businesses into public policy. Now, I'm not a believer that you can run government like a business, but I believe government can be run with business principles much more than it has in the past. This also means 2,000 new homes, 176,000 square feet of industrial, 350,000 square feet of office, and 220,000 square feet of retail. This hits everybody. Again, minor increases. In terms of, we received some city data, the taxable sales in the city of Prescott still continuing to go up. The story is consistent. Single family permits had a little bit of a soft 2018 compared to 2017, but still moving up. Prescott Valley sales tax revenues strong. Single family permits not increasing as much, but still decent. Now, what would we need to do to develop these what-if scenarios on on what the future will look like? What are these increments of economic growth that you can capture in what you do? Let's just cover a few things. So first, what are the risks? Labor quality is a major one. When we advise on economic development projects and talk to site selectors, labor quality, actually, it's not just labor quality, it's cost effectiveness. You don't necessarily want the cheapest bidder to be building the next rocket. You want the most cost-effective builder to build the next rocket. It's like that with labor. We don't want to advertise ourselves as the cheapest. We want to be the best value. And if we're the best value, and we message it that way and we can back it up, that's when all this stuff on the what-if scenario can happen. But there's a lot of things that make an economy tick. But with the risks, even budget issues. The balancing a budget is an economic development tool because when you don't have a balanced budget or you don't plan for a downturn properly, you have major problems. It screws up your public policy planning and you set yourselves back several years. But we've been working on some of these topics. But on the budget, here's something to think about. And we were criticized a little bit for backing up the governor's position on the $1 billion budget stabilization fund. But I did it because of math. So if we have a mild downturn, more like 2001, that's actually going to erode the state budget revenue trend by $1.5 to $2.5 billion, probably closer to $2 billion. The $1 billion budget stabilization fund gets us about halfway there. We're still going to have to find ways to cut budgets. We'll have to find revenues, but we have to be very careful. And that's why I think all ideas, there was some discussion about Prop 123 and trust land monies being used for certain things. I think everything needs to be thrown on the table and discussed intelligently, but not discussed as a political discussion, discussed as a business investment decision and how do we maximize our business, which is growing the economy. So even though we have this large budget stabilization fund, it's still going to get tight. I like to look at these things as opportunities, though, all of these risks. So we have a strong economic foundation. There's a lot more coordination than I saw during the downturn and immediately after the downturn among various economic development groups. Now, you always have a few groups that tend to butt heads, and I have the same thing. There are just some economists in the state that I think are idiots. So you can be professional, but you can be realistic at the same time as long as you just don't name names. But the opportunity is to show return on investment again. And I'm hitting on this because this is what gets through to policymakers. When you talk return on investment and you're talking about maximizing the use of taxpayer funds, it's not a political issue, it's an economic issue. And it's an opportunity to have a stronger base, which provides the revenues that you need for all the other stuff that you want. You have to have that strong foundation. What do we want? We want higher wages, obviously. We want continued growth, but we don't want higher wages because of some economic inefficiency. So if you have higher wages in certain areas, like construction has seen that, if it's because of shortages, on net, that's negative for the economy. If it's a productivity increase, it's a net positive. So there's still some things that we have to work out in terms of that, but I think we're going to have a more stable economy and more stable tax revenues going forward. And I've been saying this, and I'm fully confident we're going to be pleasantly surprised with our 2020s if we continue down this path of investing, but being responsible with it. How can we get there? I like this slide because it aggravated some friends once. Some economic development folks don't like it. That stone, does everybody know what curling is? I stayed up late that night and watched that gold medal. It was like 3 a.m. I felt sick the whole next day, but it was cool. It's fun. So they slide, for those that don't know, you slide a stone down an ice path, picture like a bowling alley type of a thing. There's a big target at the end. The stone is the economy. The stone's going that direction, and it doesn't matter what we do individually. It's not going to turn around and come back the other way. But those other folks, the sweepers, and I think they're called like the roughers or whatever it is, if the stone's going too fast and it's going past the target, you sweep some ice in front of it and it slows it. You sweep it away if you need to speed it up, and you can make it go left and right, speed up and come back. That's our economy, and that's what economic development and public policy is. We're the sweepers. The stone is the economy. Whenever we have policy that tries to change the direction of that stone, it's a disaster, and it ends up being inefficient, and it's a terrible use of taxpayer money. Now, the reason that I bring this up is that I still feel like we can affect our economic growth despite the fact that we do have limits on what we can do. And that's why economic development change has to happen over a long period of time. Want to emphasize growing well. Productivity is the way to increases in productivity is the way to increase incomes, not the labor shortages. And if you go, I kept it in, okay. I had to provide this. I had a very short intro at a presentation on an education panel. And I didn't want to be discussing the value of some of the tax increase proposals that are out there, good or bad. I wanted to try to explain for my portion what we need to be thinking about. And when we're talking about factors of production, so what impacts productivity? That's more fundamental in economics than basic supply and demand. Productivity is what increases the quality of life of people. And there are references all the way back to Plato. I took history of economic thought, and so I referenced Adam Smith, who I actually have a picture of on the back of my business card, but I didn't want it to be real bold, so it's watered out a little bit. And everybody says it's cool I have George Washington on the back of my business card. And so when I order new ones, I'm gonna have to figure that out. But these things, investing in education and research and development, that's increasing productivity of labor and capital. This is economics. This is even conservative economics. It's not the topic of increasing funding in education or all these different things. You have to find the right balance. And this is where I get to my favorite slides, but I found that it's not as popular among the college students because they don't know what it is. There's lots of things that make the economy tick. When I worked at the JLBC, and I was right out of college, and I was terrified of lawmakers, and I bought my first nice shoes, penny loafers, and they had a smooth bottom, and I didn't sand them a little. I remember this because I was flying down the hallway, and I slid into the wall where Ted Ferris was, the director, and the assistant director was right next to him. But I think it made me look cool because I was hauling butt over to talk to some lawmakers. And I had my pad with me, and it was, I want to work on some economic development stuff. And I was waiting to have a great conversation, and it was simply, what are the benefits if we reduce the vehicle license tax? And I'm like, okay, yeah, we can look at that. I was forecasting the revenues for that. Anything else? Like, no. It was always just the tax cut discussion. And I like downturns forcing agencies to have to find the nickels in the couch, and that's a way of cutting the fat in government. But in this case, back then, those discussions, it was all about tax policy. The left wanted to raise taxes, the right wanted to reduce it, and that's not how the economy works. This is closer to how the economy works. This is my favorite slide, and I've used this since I had to present to some fairly conservative lawmaker friends down at the Capitol, and I needed to just very briefly get to what makes an economy tick. And the reason I like this is that when we cleaned out my grandfather's den after he passed away, true story, there were 3 of these things. And it's because an engineer has one that he uses, or she uses, one that is good for parts, and one that you keep in a box just in case they stop making it. Now, when you stop making it, it's usually because I made a better one, but we found 3 of everything. But the key is, it isn't turning the volume up and down on taxes. Turning the volume up doesn't increase the sound quality. It's finding the right balance among each of these frequencies. So on a stereo equalizer, if you move taxes up, there'll be some negative economic repercussions. But then if it's used for something else where spending increases, that would have partially offsetting. But you have to figure out what the opportunity cost is on sliding this dial to find the right balance. I like to say that every dollar that's used for a tax cut has an economic benefit. But is the economic benefit bigger than if that dollar was used in an area where we needed to invest a little more? It's trade-offs. Every dollar that we spend on education at some margin has a benefit. But is that dollar going to have a bigger economic benefit than if we became more competitive in a tax rate in an area where we weren't competitive? So it's actually far more complicated. The discussion is still a little bit around that volume dial, but now it's getting to here. And more folks are understanding it. And I purposely kept this in a lot of speeches since that time because I feel like this is the one that matters the most. If I had one slide, it would be this one. I could talk for hours on this one. This is a real world though, right? Lots of things matter, but we're not there yet. If we can master this, then we can incrementally move on to the more complicated stuff. Now, folks that work for individual groups, like let's say one of my favorite groups is GPEC and my friend Chris Camacho, they have a very specific role. So they're in charge of one of those left sections, but they're really good at what they do. And if they coordinate with a group that's really good with the next section, you don't have to become an expert in everything. You have to coordinate and share information. If you try to become an expert in everything, you end up becoming an expert in nothing. So we'll get there eventually. So conclusions, good diversified economy here. I continue to like what I'm seeing in terms of the statistics. We have to continue to work on the higher value added industries. That's easier said than done. But there will be more opportunities in this region going forward. Workforce issues, we still need to address these throughout the state, but again, we have to look at effective, cost-effective ways of doing it. And dozens of smaller issues, like I was talking before about the physician shortages and things like that. But if each community can cooperate with a county entity if it's appropriate, or the right state entity, but hone it down to an individual list that can be done, and you actually can say our goal is to finish on a certain date. That's the key for me. I can always tell if somebody has a good public policy idea when they bring it to us and they ask if we want to analyze it. I try to picture, can it go into a bill? If it's something where it's just generic and it can't even go into a bill, there's not a whole lot we can do down at the Capitol. It's got to be honed down further and further. Now, economic development policy doesn't have to go into a bill if it's coordination, but it's got to go into an agreement that people have. So be specific, but be proud, because I'm very bullish on what's happening here, and I write that very rarely. The other word apparently I write more often, but I don't use this lightly. Again, very impressed with what I've been seeing, and the 2020s for you all is going to be fantastic. If you want to shoot me an email, well, I get a little feisty on Twitter, so you may or may not want to do that. But if you go to Rounds Consulting, you can see roundsconsulting.com. You can get my email in case any of you are interested in asking if we have a particular data point or a slide on something, or would like to see a larger deck. I'm happy to share that kind of information with anybody whenever they need it. And do we still have time for Q&A, or did I ramble too much?
We do. Let's do some Q&A.
Okay.
Since I'm holding the mic, I'm going to ask the first one, if that's okay. Kind of in the middle of the deck, you had a slide that showed our projected growth of 2,000 homes, and you had some industrial office and retail predictions based on if we can meet that growth number. What is the algorithm of rooftops that equal square footage of industrial or office or retail? How do you calculate that growth?
And so those numbers that was just for that small wedge. That tiny wedge results in that. That was looking at, and we've done economic models up here too, that was looking at standards. So in general, here's what you would see if we continued to grow at a similar pace and mix. So a specific number, no, it depends on the quality, but that's a pretty good ballpark number. And I like to show those because it's a way for people to grasp these tiny slivers of changes in growth often pay for the things that you need to produce the tiny slivers of growth.
So it looks like Arizona's doing great, the US is doing well, the rest of the world, not so much. What's the impact there? There's economists who say we're actually already in a global recession. What if a year from now, because they seem to announce a year later, right? They go back and say, hey, a year ago, we started a recession. What if that's the case? Right now, we just started a recession. What impact do you see that having on the US and Arizona?
So let me answer that in two ways. One, that's an excellent point. Global slowdown for sure. When you see a country like China slowing, it might be going from 6.5% growth to 3.5%. It's a matter of, is this kind of a correction or is it truly a global recession? I wouldn't necessarily categorize it as a recession, but that's one of those rocks in that bucket. And I like the point that you made about sometimes we're in a downturn before we realize it. This is one of the great failures of economists quite often. In fact, even after 9/11, back in 2001, after we had that impact, a lot of economists were saying we're going to have a recession pretty soon. The recession started in March that year. So you can't quite tell, but if you look at enough of the indicators, you can feel good that the next year, solid, look for that inconsistent data. And I think that's where people don't really focus on. They don't look at the story. They don't try to say, is it becoming that inconsistent part? But it will drag the US down. I think our strength, though, is still enough where it'll be more like, it'll be a typical recession for the US and a more typical recession for us. And ours are usually relatively mild, but we'll have a couple of years to get through that pain. So it'll still be tough. That was a good question.
Yes, I have a question about growth versus good growth. And next year, we're all going to be voting here in Arizona about recreational marijuana. We know that, and I'm just saying this policy-wise, not politically. We saw that what happened in Colorado, a lot of people regretted it. Do you see any kind of implication there in terms of the banks and things like this, and how they're going to handle passing such a policy?
By coincidence, we did the forecast for the group that put that together of the revenues. We didn't analyze any of the policy. I talked to friends. I actually talked to some of my conservative friends ahead of time, and I said, how do you feel if we're the pot economists now? And their response was, we'd rather see good numbers. We're not out there promoting it, but I know about it and had to do a lot of research. When you take a look at, even though you hear some of the bad stories, when you take a look at, this is for economics only, not social issues and some of the health and welfare, but on the economic issues, the metro area that is crushing us the most when you make all the proper adjustments continues to be Denver. We still have some of the Texas state metros. Salt Lake is a major competitor. Compared to a lot of our major metros, when you compare Phoenix, a big chunk of our state, we have a ways to catch up. I talked to site selector friends and I asked if this is something where they're concerned about yet, and the answer is no, because it's hard to know how it's going to be implemented. Some of the folks in California that were criticized for forecasting $1 billion in tax revenues and 200 million came in, well, they didn't know that 80% of the cities weren't going to adopt the rules that are needed for the dispensaries to open. So a lot of it depends on that. On the economic side, you will see the impact if there's some significant social and healthcare issues that aren't properly addressed. Some of the revenue is going to be going towards public safety, some of the revenue towards transportation, and some of the revenue towards workforce, specifically community colleges, and probably linking to a lot of our rural communities. So on the economic side, I'm not worried yet, but it's something I will be paying attention to.
Any more questions?
I do. Okay, so I was looking at your all your charts, and you had brought up education, and I feel like education is one of those things that kind of holds people back because it's so expensive for kids to go to college, and yet that's one of the things that helps you get a better job that pay higher, the tech stuff, and all those. Have you done any studies that would show, hey, if we, instead of like doing a tax cut, made education a little more affordable for people, what would that do to our economy? And is there anything in the works?
I think that everything is tied together. So I'm actually in favor of a flatter income tax, but I'm also working with ABOR on their budget request because they committed to a shift from requesting a large amount of money. I don't want to say for more philosophical reasons, but we need this amount of money for these specific programs, and we're anticipating an ROI of X. And I know that math's going to be done well because we're working on that. But so we're seeing some additional investment in higher ed. At the community college level, after losing the two metro areas lost the state funding, there was some push to restore that, but the tax rates are still relatively low. On the cost of education, even though tuition has gone up quite a bit, a ton since I went to ASU, we have one of the lower levels of student debt in the country compared to the degrees that are being received. It's actually very competitive. So it's kind of, for me, it's on the margin of, kind of like with housing, it's on the margin of being unaffordable versus it's okay. If the average student debt is like 21,000, that's fine. Don't work full time like I did during school. Spend some time and have a little fun and study more, and you'll make that money paying off. You don't want to get into $100,000 of debt though. But we need people to figure out what they want to do. Unlike myself, where I still didn't know even in graduate school, we need people to figure out what their opportunities are and their limitations and chances to explore it. That's why some economic developers are even focused on local market industries like construction and others, to let people know you're not just up on the rooftop banging nails into trusses. You have opportunities in lots of different areas that pay quite well. So education is going to be a big part. Higher ed is easier for me to analyze. I've been participating with a lot of groups on K-12. I disagree with the extent that taxes need to be raised. I have a particular threshold that I feel like I could defend on an economics perspective. That's much lower than what's being discussed, but I don't want to share that just yet. But that's going to continue to be discussed as well. And if that marijuana initiative passes, there's going to be about $100 million that's going to go towards workforce training through the community colleges. After about 4 or 5 years of ramping up, I don't know if it's going to pass or not. I'm part libertarian, so I'm more agnostic. But if it does, I want to make sure I'm plugged into the group that's going to be furthering the purpose in the next legislative session to make sure that it's used efficiently and the right areas get the funding.
Good morning, Ron. Thank you. Have you done any research on the higher value return industries that we contract here in our area?
Yes. One thing that'll come out of the NACOG study is we separate it. It's still in draft form. In fact, that's where I have to go after this. But it's been a great exercise in learning the broader region. I already was pretty familiar with Yavapai, but I got to learn it more. But on each of the counties, what we did is, and no one has done this before, but it's so simple, is they talk about target industries in general and say, let's do some stuff. Well, we took a look at the occupations, the top occupations, and we sorted them by scale. If you have an occupation that's relatively robust in an area, the economic fundamentals must be supporting that, or it wouldn't be robust, unless it was a fluke, but you can check that. Then you want to look at these occupations where the median wage has a big gap from maybe the 50 percentile to the 75 percentile. Why is it that in, say, Yavapai, in a particular occupation, we're a little bit lower, but there still are some folks up here at this higher percentile? Can we get more? Can we make that part of the industry bigger? And then there'll be a few other things. So that'll be a document that I think it gets published in December, but there'll be some Yavapai specific things. And I would encourage the economic development plans. I know there was an airport study because we didn't win. That was a joke, isn't it? I believe that you probably have pretty up-to-date economic development plans. But what I also recommend is don't wait 3 years, let it sit on the shelf, and then spend a ridiculous amount of money updating it with somebody that barely knows the community. 3 years later, make it an ongoing process where you're always improving it. You wouldn't say, here's my business plan and my employees and their wages. Let's readdress it and have a meeting in 3 years. I think that could be an opportunity here because I can see that legitimately happening here.
Since this is a local economic development thing and the topic of education came up, I recently got my property tax bill, which everybody probably did too. About half of the property taxes goes to education. And from an affordability standpoint, I don't know if there's anybody from Yavapai College that can speak to this here, but Yavapai College has been advertising a free degree. And so anybody that wants to get a degree, as I understand it from Yavapai College, you enroll, you do it, you graduate in 2 years, and they pay back 100% of the money that you paid. So there's funding in place that if somebody wants to get an education, they can get it and not pay anything in our community.
Oh, and one more thing kind of on that. I'm big on apprenticeship programs and trying to find a way of helping businesses that can't quite cover the gap and offer more programs, a way of getting that funding to them so that the folks that you would that you hate to see leave the area because they can't find the high-tech job that they want. We were talking about higher wage industries. Set that up, that makes the business stronger, and it makes a more robust workforce locally. But that's another individual item that can be developed, but there just has to be some emphasis on the small. It's okay to play small ball. I grew up a Giants fan, San Francisco Giants, because we had no baseball team back then. They won 3 World Series in 5 years, and they didn't deserve any of them. It's because of small ball and pitching. Sometimes that works. You don't have to hit a home run every time. You put a lot of good smaller projects together, smaller policy projects together, you can do quite well. Sorry to any Dodger fans, but you're clearly in the lead this year, so you can.
Let's go Dodgers.
Okay, final call on questions.
Oh, yeah, let me one add. Morning, Jim. John Kazicki with Veterans Gardens. I have a question. You know, the numbers are what the numbers are. However, when we go back 10, 11, 12 years ago when the economy was in the world that hurt, my recollection is that the federal government came in and they reestablished the formula for calculating unemployment. Because at the time it was pretty horrific, the numbers, and then all of a sudden they recalculated and go, oh, that's not so bad. Right? And I think they may have done the same with GDP, I'm not positive on that. But are you comfortable with the numbers we're receiving?
I'm comfortable with the numbers, but not with the explanation. And what happened before, and I actually I called the federal government, I wrote to some of our Congress folks, and Arizona, believe it or not, as bad as things were, there was a fairly robust package put together at the federal government level that wasn't real efficient, poorly designed, but it is what it is. And Arizona, and it had to do with housing problems. Arizona was deemed in too good a shape because they looked at our unemployment rate and they said, you don't quite meet the threshold. We were hit more than anybody. They should have looked at the underemployment because we had so many beat down folks, they stopped looking for work, they're not counted. We had one of the worst underemployment and they didn't look at it right. Right now, we have a very low unemployment rate that looks a little stronger than the broader economic story. It's still good, but a lot of that has to do with demographic shift, baby boomers, things like that. So it's still an accurate number, a solid number, but you have to take it with a grain of salt because in reality, if it goes up a little bit more, I'm not real worried about it. And I very rarely put the unemployment numbers in presentations these days.
All right, let's give Jim a big round of applause.
Thanks for having me, I appreciate it.